Hi everyone, and welcome to this panel 9, how to counter disinformation in the Western Balkans. So I'd like to invite onto the stage our wonderful panelists and moderator, Jasna, Jelisic, Milan, Jovanovic, Rasa, Nedeljkov, Anastasia Romanuk, and our moderator, Dr. Marko Milosavljevic. Thank you all very much.
Moderator da proći. Kako?
A dobro, ja sam na sredini, da.
To je to. Tako je, namjer. Šti to, ja ću ovdje, to je to.
Šti ovdje?
Ne, okej. Sad smo se dobro.
Okay. Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming here for our panel and discussion on the disinformation in the Western Balkans. I have here four extremely relevant speakers, my panelists, whom I'll invite to their presentation, so to speak, or first remarks in a few seconds. But let me start by saying that it seems that everybody here more or less agrees about the importance of the question of fighting against disinformation in the Western Balkans, as much as, of course, throughout Europe, not just throughout European Union. We've heard in a number of panels the question of disinformation, fake news, different narratives coming from different strategic stakeholders who are interested in spreading disinformation throughout Europe for different purposes. Political, economic, of course, military, information, etc., etc. My starting point, so to speak, will be the question of what is being done in the Western Balkans from a number of perspectives. The first one is, of course, the perspective of international stakeholders, such as European Union, European Commission, but also, of course, Council of Europe, OECD, by preparing new sort of pioneering acts, such as Media Freedom Act, which is following the Digital Services Act, fighting against both the media disinformation as well as platform disinformation. There is also the question of what national governments and other national stakeholders are doing in the region, in the Western Balkans, because we're aware Western European Union is doing things for European Union, so to speak, and different governments in the region are doing specific things, sometimes following European Union example, but also very often being involved themselves in very problematic practices regarding disinformation. Here we are in Serbia, where actually research recently produced by organization CRTA shows that actually the majority of disinformation in Serbia is produced and disseminated by the largest media, which is mostly state-affiliated or government-affiliated, as it was recently defined by Twitter. Many of those media outlets are mainly financed with the support of state-owned telecom, and the role of the government in this regard is, in a way, very problematic, not just looking from the international perspective, looking at the interests of Russia or Hungary or many other stakeholders, but also from national question. We heard also at previous panel the question of the spread of disinformation regarding LGBT or immigrants and so on. So we will start our discussion first by looking at what the European Commission and European Union has done in this regard. It has done a pioneering act of Media Freedom Act, which is something that they were never involved so far. We've had a number of also meetings over the past few years, because unfortunately Slovenia was also part of a very unfortunate network of countries involved in all sort of disinformation and problematic government policy. And so we had discussions with Vice Chair Vera Jourova, meetings with Chair Ursula von der Leyen regarding these issues, and I think that Slovenia was one of the countries that persuaded them to also move forward towards this area. And so I'd like to ask first Ms. Jasna Jelisic, who is working, of course, with European Union, to first sort of define what is, in your perspective, the role of European Union, European Commission in the fight against disinformation, what it has done, and what, in a way, it cannot do.
Yeah, Thank you. Good to see you all. What is really important to understand that the EU got into this field probably among the first ones and at the request of the EU member states. Usually whoever understands the European Union, it's a composition, it's a complex structure. And this field is something that is not related to the common market, it's not related to the fundamentals that the EU has responsibilities. So it was the member states who realized that something's happening in their own societies with destabilization, with weaponizing information to turn the citizens against their own interest, and basically to affect social cohesion, to deceive citizens. And they basically asked the issue to also be looked at the EU level. And the first operation, you might remember, it was action plan against disinformation, drafted in the division that I work in, the European Action Service in Brussels, and then European Democracy Action Plan, then the whole set of measures protecting the integrity of the European elections. And I don't know if you listened yesterday, Commissioner Jourova spoke a lot about this new package of democratization package and the package of measures that is aimed to protect democracy within the European Union. So basically, what has been recognized is that disinformation and information manipulation, not only disinformation, you can manipulate information environment without doing actions that fall into the definition of disinformation. We realize that it's done to undermine the European project. And then we also realized that at the same time, the same type of manipulation is done to undermine the major EU policy for this particular region, which is the accession process, stabilization and association process, and the process of enlargement. So in this whole kind of cacophony of kind of antagonizing, first of all, antagonizing citizens of the EU against the EU citizens, it's also the similar operation to antagonize the population of the Western Balkans against the EU, where they want to join, and when given the opportunity, they move into not being able to wait any longer for these democratic standards to be achieved in the Western Balkans. So a huge amount of work has been done. I mentioned some policy actions, and you mentioned some, not only Digital Service Act, Digital Media Act, Media Freedom Act, Artificial Intelligence Act is coming. So we are really working very closely with our international partners of trying to deal with this at systematic level. You know, first of all, dealing with the platforms, especially big platforms. I think today Digital Service Act is coming through, and there are all sorts of measures. But in all of this, what I wanted to say is that the EU, if you expect this problem to be taken care of by the EU alone, it will not happen, because it cannot happen. For us to succeed with all of this, we need citizens, we need civil society, we need partners, and we need governments who engage in the whole of a government approach to facilitate whole of a society participation. The nature of this beast is as such that the EU alone, without partnerships, and with every citizen knowing what to do in the 21st century, when we are so much exposed to manipulation, is really something that needs to be taken into consideration. I heard a lot of frustration and a lot of criticism, and some of them not very constructive, about the EU. I also sometimes have a feeling that we need to kind of explain what do we mean when we say the EU. Because the EU is EU institutions, the EU is member states, and the critical part of the EU are the EU citizens. So we are all the EU, and the EU is and will always be what the citizens make out of it, and the EU will be built here in the region as long as the citizens work on it, apart from civil society organizations and institutions. So awareness raising, amazing work has been done. Resilience building, a lot of amazing work already done. And some of the people who are actually doing that work will probably tell you more about it. Media literacy initiatives, support to media organizations, a lot of initiatives that will tackle the issue of transparency of media ownership, because this is something also that we look into in the EU member states. And whatever we do and offer to the member states, we do and offer to future member states, but we need to have partners to succeed in this.
Thank you very much. Milan Jovanovic from Montenegro, you have, of course, also the sort of field experience with fighting against fake news in the sense of fact-checking and other actions, but you have actually now moved to different sort of actions. Can you explain a little bit the situation in Montenegro, both in relationship with the government, what the government is doing, the civil society, and, of course, which forms of your strategic work is most successful?
Well, that's a broad question for the short time we have, so I'll try to be brief, even though that's not my big side. I would like to start by making a parallel to something that Jasna just mentioned. She said that the EU alone cannot help member countries fight disinformation. And just as Russia or any foreign malign actor spreading disinformation cannot spread it successfully on their own, they need local proxies. And this is something that we have seen from the experience, not just in Montenegro, but in the regional countries. At the beginning, when my DFC, or the Digital Forensic Center, started back in 2018, we were mainly, starting or trying at some point to deal with disinformation or fact-checking, as it was still now is quite popular. But over time, we have seen it's not quite effective. Why? Because people will always believe what they want. People will always believe in information that is very close to their biases, to their political or any other bias. And if you present them with facts, it simply won't work, because they're already dug trenches and dug themselves deep inside, so it doesn't make much difference. What we are trying to do ever since then is several things, and I think it's applicable and it's still being done in many countries around the region, is putting focus on several things. First and foremost is media literacy. Media literacy is some kind of a silver bullet to this problem we are trying to achieve. Just look at Finland, for example, and this European index that is being done, media literacy index is being done every year. Finland is always in top 3. Why? Because they have advanced educational system. In history, they teach kids how several different propaganda campaigns from history. In math, they teach kids how you can lie with statistics. In art, they teach kids how photos can have different meanings. So basically, it's very acceptable, very, very useful in the digital age we live in, especially in the kids who are very, open to all kind of influences coming from primarily social media as their main source of information. So working with students, with high school kids, this is something that we are trying to achieve, since on state level, we don't have any, political will to achieve these kind of things. My government has actually needed 4 government sessions or over 1 month to side with the EU sanctions towards the Russia Federation on RT and Sputnik. And that tells you a lot, even though a NATO member. So things are not always shiny. And the next thing that I would like to conclude and open up space for conversation is that we are trying to do a more deeper analysis with the so what effect, to tell something, because dealing with this information is always dealing with consequences. We want to deal with the roots and the origins of this information. So we are trying, through deeper analysis, put together and push out to as many people and stakeholders as possible for them to see the bigger picture, as I think this information cannot be analyzed day to day. We need to have in mind the bigger, much bigger agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm moving now further east to Ukraine, where Anastasia Romaniuk is coming from Movement Opera. And I think that, as we all know, of course, the unfortunate lessons from Ukraine and as well as Russia are many. And I hope that you can help us a little bit with seeing what is in a way waiting for us here in Western Balkans or elsewhere if the propaganda and disinformation is in a way not tackled successfully.
To begin with, a little bit of general context that since regaining its independence in 1999, Ukraine kept being divided between West and East. Our political forces were always divided. Where should we go to the EU or to the Russia? And after 2014, after the Revolution of Dignity, it became unequivocal that there's no other way than the EU. And now there is no way to persuade Ukrainian society that we should turn around. But Russia never stopped trying to rise their political forces, and after the 2014, after the Revolution of Dignity, we still had pro-Russian political parties. We still had them rising in power since 2014 till 2022. It can be seen from the parliamentary elections of 2019, I'm sorry, from the local elections of 2020, where we could see that they are still were minority, but their numbers were rising. My organization, my primary field was elections. Now it's obviously changed. But we now see that those informational campaigns that we observed during the campaigning for elections, those disinformation campaigns, moreover, representatives of those pro-Russian parties are now being prosecuted for the treason, because only after the full-scale invasion, for example, I'm talking about the CRTA party, which leader is now being prosecuted for cooperating with Kremlin for preparing for the full-scale invasion. And why I'm mentioning this case, because it's very similar. This was the first thing I thought about when you mentioned the example of Montenegro, because his platform and many other proxies served as to be this proxy to move the information from the pro-Russian media, from Russian-sponsored media to Ukrainian informational space, because now you can do it directly. Now you have to have this subtle way. And these pro-Russian forces were this proxy how to induce the pro-Russian narratives, but without being seen that much, because Ukrainians won't buy it anymore if, for example, pro-Russian leaders or like pro-Russian influencers gonna speak directly. That won't work anymore. And only now, only after the full-scale invasion, we have prosecutions. We have cases that those that were suspected, those disinformation networks, have proven connections to Kremlin directly. But in our case, we had to go through all these terrors, all these tragedies to start real prosecutions. That is why, in this case, Ukraine is the example what can happen if you don't have preemptive measures. Because in our case, we didn't have any legislation for regulating social media field. For example, in Ukrainian context, social media are now dominating in Ukrainian society even more than television, and it's still not regulated. And I couldn't agree more that legislation, and for example, what EU is proposing is not a solution itself, but it's necessary milestone how to work with it. Because now, for example, we have proven cases with networks operating in social network Telegram, which are administrated from Kremlin, but Ukraine can do nothing about that, because Telegram is a company beyond the Ukrainian jurisdiction, does not cooperate with Ukrainian government, and we don't have any regulators. We don't have anything to use in this negotiation because social media state is a gray zone legislatively. How to deal with that? So now we are in a situation when we well aware that we are being attacked online and we can't do anything because we don't have this milestone, this starting point, how to talk with these big companies.
Thank you very much. I'm now moving to the host country, the Serbia, where in the past few years we have seen, of course, the tremendous amount of disinformation coming mostly not so just from some proxies, but from the main media outlets. And what we see now is also sort of similar strategy to the Russian in the past, which is sort of expanding that media presence also throughout the region. We now, for example, have many media outlets owned by Serbian state-controlled companies, such as Telecom Serbia, also in the region. For example, such as Bloomberg Adria is coming, Euronews, but also, of course, Arena and many others. We now have a registered informer in Slovenia. I'm not sure whether it is owned by the same people as in Serbia, but unfortunately the name doesn't sort of ring any bells on quality, trustworthy media that European Media Freedom Act is expecting. Rasa Nedeljkov from CRTA, what would you say is the sort of Serbian and your, of course, experience with the issue of disinformation that is perhaps sometimes not necessarily coming from, let's say, underground hidden proxies, but sometimes coming from the front pages of the main media?
Thank you very much. Well, I think that the easiest way to describe what we concluded after the years of analysis of various types of disinformation in Serbia, that nothing is true and everything is possible. As a title of a prominent writer trying to describe a situation in Russia, this is similar in Serbia. CRTA is for years now trying to combat disinformation, trying to combat false statements and to actually hold public institutions and officials to account, with not much of the success, unfortunately. And in recent years, we are trying to analyze how media are actually influencing the public opinion on crucial topics like EU accession process and since February on the war in Ukraine. And main conclusions are disappointing, basically because we realize that we don't have in our hands tools to combat it, to be quite honest. What we have as a civil society or as small pockets of the society who is interested to actually question what is offered as a main narrative is quite weak. We are facing with quite cunning kind of messaging and creating of narratives, and this is something which is perpetuating and parroted on a daily basis from all of the basically most influential media outlets. When Serbia is in question, TV stations are the most influential in creating public opinion polls. And it is not the social media, it is not the internet, but we have to actually look at this media environment as a kind of a fluid. What is happening in TV stations and those interlocutors who are trying to explain to citizens what's happening in Ukraine or why we shouldn't join the EU, then they're also being interviewed in printed daily or weekly media, or they're being available to be read in online portals. And those most influential TV stations in Serbia that are creating public opinion on crucial political issues is RTS, National Broadcast Service. And in a second place, when it comes to Ukraine, for instance, it's Happy Television. Happy Television is one among two of televisions who are mostly financed by those companies who are owned by Serbian state. So when Serbian state companies are advertising and choosing TV stations as the channels two TV stations are getting the most of the money. It's Pink Television and Happy Television. And the Pink Television and Happy Television are the most frequently being labeled by our fact checkers and our researchers as those who are spreading the disinformation. And what kind of disinformation? Disinformation that are also, like in the election period, because we are also focusing, and that's one of the reasons how we actually ended up in this mess of trying to understand the disinformation is through elections. When we were analyzing this information environment in April and May, we actually understood that out of approximately 170 analyzed narratives or messages, only 2 were false information, like strictly false that you can actually realize that there are lies. The remainder of almost 160 were those who are labeled as abuse of facts. So cunning way to actually put the true information, but in a completely wrong context and trying to undermine, basically, and that is also one of our main conclusions, undermining the EU, not promoting Russia as or glorifying Russia. Yes, there are like 20% of those disinformation or bias information in our media that are glorifying Russia. But the vast majority of those narratives are anti-Western, and which is actually being quite clever given the fact that the narratives that are being created for the past 30 years against the US, against NATO, are quite abused now these days and months to actually mimic what is happening in Ukraine and actually just continue to opening those wounds from the 1999 or actually using some atrocities like in Sarajevo, Markale, comparing it with Bucha, for instance, undermining and just the main influences actually is to create this kind of a disbelief in everything and actually also to be able to understand that everything is possible. And when I say that we have that much, not that much of the tools in our hands, when we understand that the most trusted, most influential television, TV station with the biggest share in the market, National Broadcast Service, when we analyzed just a couple of days ago from the public opinion poll, those people who would not vote to enter into the European Union are those watchers or public of the RTS. So RTS is not producing citizens or informing citizens in a way that they would actually support EU. It's always like somewhere in the middle, so it's not like a vast majority. If you would just isolating Happy Television, for instance, that would be the quite discrepancy. But that, just a couple of percentages are, those people who are watching RTS are against the EU. And this kind of, if we don't have the National Public Broadcast Service in providing critical information around certain important political or social events, if we don't have the education system, which is of course under the control of the government and one of the schools for years, it's not that something it was being changed, that we don't have that much of the influence. And unfortunate fact that Professor you mentioned is that sources of disinformation in Serbia are not Russian media, they are not being linked to any kind of foreign media, Serbian media. 80% of disinformation is sourced by Serbian media. And in those sources of information, Serbian public officials. So in Serbia, public officials are generators of disinformation, and the effect of that disinformation is that we don't trust the West, we don't trust the EU, we are looking with sympathies towards the Russia. And when you ask Serbian citizens who is responsible for the war in Ukraine, it will be evil West, not Russia.
Thank you for this observation. A few years ago, we had a conference in South Africa, and the African experts warned us, so to speak, from Europe and US, that actually when it came to the help of media in Africa, but also generally, the amount of money that US, whole Europe, whether on national level or EU and other levels, was the same as the amount that China was giving them within a week or two. So annual amount of that money was compared to 1 week or 2 weeks of Chinese money. Can European Union here, so to speak, do much about the national problems in, let's say, Western Balkans or elsewhere, if it has to fight, so to speak, with strong domestic economic, so to speak, stakeholders who have obviously a lot of also economic interest? Do they help, or is European Union sort of learning from Ukraine and Russia, also planning any other measures or suggestions and so on regarding, let's say, countries like in the Western Balkans, what to do about this sort of domestic production of disinformation?
Thank you. I mean, the tool that the EU has, and this is what I personally hoped would provide a good guidance for the Western Balkans, is the accession process. Everything is in it, you know, because it's a union of democracies governed by rule of law with the protection of human rights, including labor rights, and the media freedom and the possibility and environment in which professional media can function. Considering, I mean, I cannot believe, but you know, next year is going to be 20 years since this process started. I spent 20 years of my life trying to kind of induce this methodology to also deliver in the Western Balkans. I think all the tools that the EU have are there. You know, there is, for anybody who wants to improve the situation, should follow the recommendations that are there year after year and not being tackled. We cannot come up with a different idea of how this issue should be dealt with.
So what if the government doesn't want to?
This is precisely, well, but then this is then related to this demand. I said the EU and the Western Balkans will be what the citizens make out of it. The majority of the people in the Western Balkans, I'm talking about Western Balkans, is still for joining the EU, but we don't hear that demand in the public discourse for some reason. When you listen, even in the events like this, you don't have the articulation of that demand. You know, that it's the citizen. You know, the EU is not there to impose. Joining the EU is a voluntary process. If you want to join the EU, you need to build democracy. In order to build democracy, you need to have a rule of law and free media. These are the tools. And those who are willing to use the tools that are there are good guidance for anybody who wants to succeed in this field. And the EU is providing plenty of technical and financial support for that to be reached. That's what the EU can do. I mean, and I want to say, and I speak a lot with my friends in some of the EU member states and here in the Western Balkans, and I say, Superman is not coming, it is you. Here are the tools, here are the support, you know, this is what needs to be done. The experts spelled it out. What are the key recommendations? What is the path to get there where you said you want to go? You know, the EU is not imposing themselves. This was a voluntary, and still, when you go everywhere across the Western Balkans and also Serbia, joining the EU is strategic priority. Well, there is a path how to get there, and it was repeated yesterday several times, including by our ambassador. The path to joining is through the reforms.
If I can follow on that, we must not forget that Superman was actually a journalist. So, you know, hoping that they still have some magic power also here. What would you say?
I hope so.
What would you say is the sort of your experience in terms of Montenegro? Whether I mentioned before a wide question. So, for example, this sort of relationship between the media, the government, and of course the sort of dissemination, if not production, of disinformation.
I think that we still haven't tackled a key aspect of this information in this panel, and that is the social media. People started spreading disinformation or unverified information the moment they started speaking, and that didn't change up to this point. So it's not what matters is the way we communicate nowadays. This is what has changed. And social media has opened up a broad space of communication, and not just the space, but the speed of communication has went light speed. And this is something social media are not good nor bad. It is what we make out of them. but certain actors are trying to make the best out of social media for their political agenda. And social media, I firmly believe, haven't done so much to address this issue. There is a great book called The Ugly Truth, made by the two former employees at Facebook. It is made actually from 10,000 hours of interviews with current and former also employees at Facebook, who have been there since 2004. And I'm not going to go too much into details, but I would just conclude that the EU, or not the EU, sorry, but Facebook has actually said that there was quite a difference between what was done and what should have been done. And who wants to know more, please read the book, it's great. So just a few days ago, I found out that there is something, that we all know about, that is coordinated inauthentic behavior, which is a big problem on social media. So to translate it, it's like fake accounts that are used to spread disinformation, make content more popular, for more people to see it. Facebook is good at deleting those accounts, but it's also good at keeping the money earned from it. From 2018 to June 2021, Facebook has earned 28 million euros just by the activities of fake accounts it has deleted. So they deleted the accounts, but they kept the money. I will just go from my own experience, and the misuse of social media in Montenegro. We have noticed there was in 2020 a big political/religious tensions in my country due to the adoption of the law of the freedom of religion. And we have seen a lot, 752 fake accounts or bot accounts connected to the SNS or the ruling party in Serbia. After we reported on it, our website was taken down 3 times in 3 days, but also the Twitter reacted and deleted those accounts as well. You have to know that Twitter also deleted 8,500 bot accounts connected to the ruling party in Serbia early in 2020. So when I talk about misuse of social media, this is what I mean. And also to conclude, one party in the parliament or the one party in the government right now is engaging in, it has 54 fake accounts that I know of on Facebook, and is engaging in empowering its own reach. It's not just by sharing, but whenever you open the most prominent, actually 3 most prominent media in Montenegro on Facebook, and you find any article mentioning anyone from that party or the party in general, you would see 45 of these people just being top comments. They comment all the time, spam comments, they like each other comments and put this kind of content on the first place. And Facebook actually does nothing. I've reported numerous times. But when I say we, I mean Western Balkans is such a small market for Facebook that it doesn't necessarily, they don't even have a center here for the region. I think it's Vienna, the closest. So I don't think we are much as important as we need to be. And this is what I'm looking forward to see how the Digital Service Act that tackles social media and exercise much more pressure on them when it comes to disinformation will work out. And this is an additional reason I want Montenegro to keep its strategic priority and join the EU as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. Anastasia, you were already mentioning your problem with a similar issue that is related to Telegram. And we all seen the headlines today and yesterday about Elon Musk taking over Twitter. We've heard that Kanye West is trying to take over Parler and so on. And in the end, we realized that this is not social media. This is not public media, this is private media. And a lot of things actually do depend on the owner and their terms and conditions, which they always say this is a voluntary network. If you don't like it, you don't need to use it. So we've heard that Montenegro is not sort of successful in complaining to Facebook, for example. We've had the similar issues in the region. What would you say is sort of useful, would be a useful approach in addition to the, of course, Digital Service Act, also, of course, for the countries that are not yet members of European Union, how to tackle companies from California?
Well, we're not members yet as well. But the issue is that they mentioned coordinated behavior is a huge problem for us as well. but it takes really long time and a lot of stubbornness for such a small markets as Ukraine and Montenegro both are, how to pressure on companies, how to act on that. Because we always can say that this is a private company and they are only interested in numbers and revenues. But following scandals by scandals by scandals, there is an option how to push, even for small markets, for such a huge companies. But it's very hard job because, for example, after the several conflicts where it was proven, for example, Myanmar genocide, where it was proven by outside audit that Facebook actually holds responsibility for escalating the genocide. After that, they started investing their resources to working in such smaller markets, which are like seemingly less important than the huge EU or USA market. And when we investigated their policies, we saw that on this point for Ukrainian tiny small market, they invested the most as they have ever done. But we still have a problem that the way is still too long without the proper framework. And for example, regarding the EU, for us, for Ukraine, it's first of all very important political move, a very important signal to those companies, to their reputation, that if they don't support Ukraine and needed measures to protect our security, so at least like their shares, they are falling down. And for us, it's the best practice we can use how to improve our legislation, because once more, while it's still legislatively gray zone in the local legislation, there's not much that can be done. Because you don't have this basis what to negotiate about. Because Ukraine now in process negotiating with Meta, for example, opening the office in Kyiv after our winning. But this is a long way after producing at least projects for legislation how to regulate social media and online platforms in Ukrainian legislation. And this is exactly what was said, that you cannot treat EU as a cure. It's a very important move. But other work should be done by ourselves, and we keep doing it by ourselves. And for example, in Ukraine, once with another networks, and they started responding more and more. It's still not enough, but they start respond even to small markets. For example, in our last elections, they are deleting these coordinated networks. We found at least 3, and they also reported that they keep deleting that. But it's the issue of constant pressure. And with the measures which, for example, EU is doing, it's even helping the small markets like us to be listened to.
Jasna, you wanted to follow up this.
Precisely what I wanted to follow up. You might recall that in the EU we started dealing with the big tech, first kind of getting them to self-regulate. We have tried self-regulation. It didn't go very far. Hence the regulation, and we will see how far this regulation goes, and I'm sure we will go further as much as we can legally, because precisely for these reasons, the small languages, small markets, but also the big languages and the big markets, it's equally difficult. So this is why we are where we are. But what I also wanted to maybe use this opportunity, because there is always kind of doom and gloom, but I also want to kind of maybe share one of my observations. Regardless of all of this, and also not every big platform behaved in the same way. They are not all made equal, nor they behave the same. Some are worse than the others. But what I wanted to say, it's an industrial scale of sharing this information. And this information is not new. It has always been used. And as a colleague said, every single person can do something good or something bad, can spread truth or manipulate, and even in this room or anywhere else. So this is really, nobody else is going to sort out this problem. Everybody should take a piece of responsibility for this. I think we as an active citizens, and what we saw in some of the EU member states is that citizens decided to contribute to this in an organized way, with the elves, with, not only civil society, even as a citizen who does something else, runs a bakery and so on. Of course, you cannot, you cannot expect the issue to be taken care of, that you contract that out or expect civil society to do it, state to do it, EU to do it, or Superman, which I mentioned. It is you. Everybody can do something. And I think this is really important, that a message that we don't underline long enough. And I also want to say that this gives me hope, regardless of all of this, and massive disinformation operations. I mean, we saw them with financial crisis, when the EU was kind of to be undermined, the EU is going to go broke, and the EU will disappear as we know it. When you read the opinion polls, in majority of the EU member states, the popularity of the EU went up, regardless of these operations. Massive disinformation operations during the COVID. We looked at the opinion polls again, which is something that we cannot hear very often in the Western Balkans, since that's why I'm sharing. During the COVID, massive disinfo operations against the EU and the Western partners in general. The popularity of the EU in majority of the EU member states went up. The third one, and I will stop, when the aggression on Ukraine started, we read the opinion polls the month after. The popularity and the demand of the EU citizens in the majority of the EU member states was up, expecting the EU to do more to help with the crisis. Regardless of all of this, somewhere, maybe due to some media literacy, critical thinking, whatever it is, it's not in all member states, I'm talking about majority of the member states, people have this basic resilience to be resilient. The disinformation in the current stage, that things cannot be stopped. But our resilience to it, discussions like we have now, and what partners in the Western Balkans brilliantly do, and I have to say, it's encouraging for all of us trying to help this process going forward, to see that there are partners in the Western Balkans, they come from the civil society, who want to work on this. But of course, civil society cannot do it alone. So shared responsibility is what I want to say. Shared responsibility for EU-Western Balkans relations, shared responsibility for our security in Europe. EU cannot deliver it alone, is what I want to say. And it's even one of the conclusions of the EU-Western Balkans Summit in Brdo, that said we share the responsibility for the implementation of this policy, and we share responsibility for communication about this policy.
Can I just follow then here with Russia, for mentioning, you were mentioning resilience, and I'm currently working at the experts group at Council of Europe, which is basically called the experts group on media resilience, trying to help public service media, but also other relevant media, like trustworthy media, as it's mentioned in Media Freedom Act, to sort of fight doom and gloom. Russia, what would be your sort of response to the question of this? What is keeping you up? In a country with all this situation and so on, what is it? Is it international partners? Is it citizens? Is it, what is sort of keeping this from sort of stopping you?
I'm afraid to speak up after the enthusiasm from Jasna's side. When I wanted to assess what's happening here, I will actually rather quit. We are in an extremely difficult situation, and the only thing that keeps us actually is understanding that we are not trying to win the quick wins. In this, we are talking about the decades-long creation of narratives, of undermining everything that is progressive, capturing basically all of the mechanisms in one society that is able to form the critical thinking and influence, questioning what is being offered as a main narrative. And in that sense, I mentioned in the first address that the education system in Serbia is completely locked for any of the values that we are talking when we are having in mind the European Union. And just to be aware, the disinformation and all of these kind of cunning operations are not aimed to directly undermine EU. That's not one of the main purposes. It's actually to establish the ruling parties as the only actor who is relevant to solve all of the problems. So continuous creating fear among the people by catastrophic scenarios in EU. We maybe forgot that we had COVID crisis. In the crisis headquarters of Serbian governmental crisis headquarters was the #1 most vocal person who was the #1 spreader of the disinformation regarding the COVID in the governmental body. We got the Minister of Health, who is the anti-vax. I don't know how to say it in English, but you get me what I want to say.
Anti-vaxxer.
Anti-vaccine, yeah. So we are talking about completely losing any kind of a compass there. So yes, as an activist, obviously I would like that percentages that my colleagues, I see Vujo Ilic here, who was doing the public opinion research, and when we see the data, one of the hopes for us is that in this latest public opinion poll, more citizens are for democracy than for the authoritarian type of the government, despite all of the brainwash that we are exposed to. And it is really a good question. How can we bypass the all mainstream media? How can we bypass online media that pretty much all of the online media most influential or being watched are those who are owned by the either strongest TV stations or print media? So that is the pretty much and the social media in Serbia as a source of information for forming the public opinion poll. Public opinion is not that influential. It's not that big. So it might be the case in some other societies. In Serbia, it's not. So when we have this in mind, and when we have in mind that public officials, the president and the ministries who are the mostly present in those mainstream media, are creating the environment where EU is not a goal for us, where narratives that are basically further undermining the West and pushing up the Russia. So if we have this elite who has pretty exclusive access to the media, when it comes to the pluralism, 91% of all interlocutors in central news on most influential terrestrial TV stations in Serbia are coming from the government. Okay. 91%. So they have the access to the most influential tool in creating public opinion, and the effect of that public opinion, of those messaging, is that EU is not the goal for us. So if we would be voting on this Sunday on referendum whether we should join the EU or not, we would not join the EU.
Very sobering thoughts. We're still back to doom and gloom, unfortunately, but we are in Serbia, of course. So we have some time for one brief question or comment from the audience. So in spite of the fact that I don't see much, but I think I see a raised hand over there, so I hope you will get a microphone and you will be able to address the question.
Hello to everyone. I have rather a comment and a question. My name is Maria Zolkin. I'm head of regional security and conflict studies at Ukrainian think tank, Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Jasna raised the issue about, let's say, contribution or partial responsibility of citizens to spreading the, let's say, not objective, I don't like this word when it comes to information, but the more or less, let's say, balanced information. But I want to raise the issue of responsibility of media, including not only state, but those who claim to be independent and objective and following some standards. Another speaker raised the issue about the media literacy of the population. And again, I want to raise the issue of media literacy and critical thinking of journalists. Couple of examples based on Ukraine and Russia war. Reuters, New York Times, couple of other international media started saying when part of Ukrainian territory was occupied that the only one actually legal Ukrainian authorities governing Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Luhansk region are pro-Ukrainian authorities. This is the responsibility of media to use correct terms and not to create for international audience in different countries the narrative that there is pro-Russian authorities and there is pro-Ukrainian authorities in the region, which was absolutely obviously occupied by Russia. Deportation, which is going on right now in Kherson region, it's named evacuation, regardless of the fact that any legal specialist or lawyer will tell you that relocation of civilian population is prohibited to the occupying powers, so it's very easy to check if the media has at least a will to make a fact-check balance procedure and to ask any specialist about that. So how to deal with this problem? Because as of now, me as an expert following the issue, I have to address editors, journalists, when I see this kind of information going on online, on air, in important media, but how to tackle this issue when it comes to huge media platforms? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. I would like to address actually to Milan and also Jasna. Depends.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
I would love to.
Maybe I can jump in first.
Just for the literacy and the media.
So basically, coming from a small country with a lot of different media and political agendas behind the media, I think it's really always the question of, actually there are two questions that needs to be addressed. First, it is the speed versus the truthfulness of the information, because media live from clicks and from visits. If they don't publish anything first, they lose the views and they lose the income. So I've talked a lot about media in my country and I got the answer. If we don't put it out right, someone else will. If we don't put the information first, some of the colleagues will do it. And then we'll lose the exclusive. I've seen numerous times they put out the information and then just to be for the sake of being first, and then you have the history of edits and you can see like 15, 20 edits in the next hour. But they can boast, oh, we did it the first. Being in, let's say, in Montenegro, you have a guy, maybe I'm stepping out of the question, but I would like also to point out regarding the Ukraine and the media. And how problematic of that issue is still in my country. Nevertheless, we are much geographically far from the conflict. You have a guy in Montenegro that was a journalist that was sent openly by the Russian embassy to first Moscow, a few days before the aggression, and then he was sent to Ukraine. He was posting on Facebook and of course Telegram channels how he moved forward together with Russian troops in occupied Ukrainian territories. And Montenegrin media transmitted that information. No, they just published how he went, pro-Russian media. They didn't even side with professional journalist ethics, no, just to forbid that kind of content, because it's not ethical to do such activities. But still, we weren't able to do nothing about it. Today, this guy has over 10,000, in 1 month, 10,000 subscriptions to his Telegram channels. And he's not alone. He works together with a big network of pro-Russian proxies in my country. Okay. Montenegro is very split, to conclude, very split. And this is why we cannot do anything about it. It's split between East and the West, just like Ukraine was, not now. And whenever you want to tackle these sort of things, you meddle into freedom of speech. And this is where the problem begins. So it's really hard to answer the question. We didn't fail. We will fail once we stop trying. And that's it.
Thank you, and Jasna.
Very briefly, thank you so much for raising a very important question. In all of this, the role of journalists in media is immensely important. You know, so What I'm going to say, I mean, what you mentioned could be what we call misinformation, which is unintentional error. Sometimes journalists do not know things well, or maybe they're not aware how much words matter. Some journalists, and that once when you framed an issue or call it a certain way, then you frame a narrative, and then, that it's not only that war wins, but that story wins. So, huge responsibility. Also, who can be considered a journalist? There is a lot of content these days that postures as journalism, but it's not. To be called a journalist or to be considered a media outlet means following a certain set of professional standards and ethics. And and working in public interest. Once when you don't do that, I mean, journalistic errors happen. I'm not talking about that. But on this, if you start pushing your own agenda, your own political views, or somebody else's, you leave journalism and you enter other professions. They can be called lobbying, they can be called PR and something else. They're not journalism anymore. If you don't follow professional standards, you do not enjoy the protection as a journalist, nor privileges as a journalist and a media outlets have. If it's about professional media that usually follow professional standards, my experience is that will self-regulate. If you have an intentional manner to disinform, which then we go into the realm of disinformation. It is not misinformation anymore, which is unintentional by lack of knowledge and something else, but it becomes intentional with the intent to harm and deceive. I am sometimes witnessing some journalists reading into and manipulating and still calling themselves journalists, and as a former journalist, it hurts me each time when I see that happening. But you raised a very important point. If it's about professional media, and we need to, part of the media literacy is educating people to be able to differentiate between content, posturing as journalistic content, which can be social media content, and something that is produced following professional standards and code of conduct.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if we managed to sort of export this, I mean, or at least to decrease the doom and gloom, but this morning was very foggy, and fortunately the sun came out, and here we have at least few people and a number of organizations that are doing all the best to destroy this doom and gloom, and I would like to thank them all for being here and discussing this information. Thank you very much.